Well, hello, welcome. Welcome to Aquashella 2022. It's Sunday. Glad you're here. Thanks for being here. Today, I switched it up a little bit. If you were here last year, we talked about ways to save money in the aquarium hobby. Today, I want to talk about some of my favorite fish. And hopefully, by the end of today, you'll be like, yeah, you know what? If you haven't caught them before, it'll give you something to think about. These are fish from Lake Tanganyika. How many of you have heard of fish from Lake Tanganyika? Like, you kind of, oh, there's a lot of cool people here. But if you haven't, don't worry, you're still cool. We're going to talk a little bit about fish from Lake Tanganyika because I really love these fish. They're cichlids, so if you're like not a cichlid person, just don't worry. What's cool about them is they come in all different shapes and sizes, and believe it or not, just about any tank size you could ever want, you could put Lake Tanganyika fish in them, from basically a 10-gallon on. So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about these different types, where they live, how they live, but I've really geared this towards the hobbyist, right? So we're not going to sit here and have, not that there's anything wrong with that, but a dry presentation on fish, like, these are the characteristics of this group. So we're gonna try to make it more geared towards us crazy fish keepers and take a look at them. So before I get started, a couple things to note. I did not do the underwater footage as much as I would have loved to gone to Lake Tanganyika and be like, I'm just swimming with the fish, this is awesome. I didn't get to do that, but if you like what you see in terms of the underwater stuff, and that's interesting, I actually pulled the underwater footage from these 3 YouTube channels, the African Diving LTD. I can't really see the screen. There's 2 more. That's where you can find that stuff if you want to take a look, learn a little bit more about the actual underwater footage, which is going to be pretty cool. All the tank footage is mine. It came from different fish room tours, mine. We did some at some of the guys in my club. Jason's fish room, not me, different Jason. It's kind of weird because when we're talking to each other, like, which Jason do you want, him or me? Who, him? No, me? Who? Okay. Mario, and then OFR. Some of you are familiar with Ohio Fish Rescue. He's got actually a really cool large Lake Tanganyikan tank, and so we're going to take a look at that today as well. So Lake Tanganyika, in case you don't know a lot about it, it's a rather large lake. This is a map. It's also over there for you people sitting over there. But there's 3 major lakes on the continent of Africa, and so way at the top you've got Lake Victoria. It's a rather wide-bodied lake. It would resemble a little bit more like the Great Lakes of the United States in some cases, where it's a little bit wider, not quite as deep. Then you've got Lake Tanganyika, our focus here today. It's a very long lake. It's a really, really, really deep lake, which is interesting because it's so deep and it doesn't have a lot of surface area. The water parameters are actually not as stable as you might think, or not as consistent, I should say, as you might think. And then down here at the bottom, you got Lake Malawi. So for those of you who are seeing like the Mbuna cichlids and the peacocks and the haps, those are those really popular cichlids. When you walk into the Petco's and PetSmarts, a lot of those fish come from Lake Malawi. So we're gonna focus right here in the center, Lake Tanganyika, and we're gonna take a look at the fish there. This is some underwater footage. I thought it was really cool. You see some brachyardi just kind of swimming around in their natural habitat. You're gonna notice as you see some of this underwater footage, if you're ever trying to do like a biotope or something, there's not really any plants there, which is gonna be, you know, you look at my tanks like, oh, you got Lake Tanganyika and plants? Yeah, because that's not what I'm not shooting for a biotope, but you got the feather fins there. It's a really cool thing, but there's not a lot of plant life in this area. Now, don't worry, I know you can't really read all that well the words, but I'm really using this picture here for the actual pictures of the lake. And what you can see is Lake Tanganyika is in the center, and we're not really gonna, I'm doing this to compare Lake Tanganyika with Lake Superior because we're maybe more familiar with that being in the United States. So what you can see is Lake Tanganyika, like I said, is a really, really, really deep lake. You know, you compare that to Lake Superior, which is like, it's huge, right? We think about the Great Lakes in the US, but because it's so deep, it doesn't have the same amount of surface, but it's got more volume because of its depth and because of its length, and that has an impact on the types of fish that we find in the lake and where we find them. This is another little figure. Again, it's got the relative sizes here. The American Great Lakes, again, Lake Superior to Lake Tanganyika, it's a little bit easier to see, but I think the thing that is really obvious and it's really interesting is the depth. Check that out. Maximum depth of Lake Tanganyika is almost 1,500 meters deep. That has a serious impact on where you're going to find fish in that lake, and it has a serious impact on the level of species that the lake will support. Because believe it or not, even though it's got such a large volume, there's not as many species as you might think, because once you go too far down, you start getting some issues with the water parameters, and a lot of fish really struggle as you go deeper. And you see here Lake Superior, the maximum depth there is around, what, 400 meters or so? So it's not even close. So when you compare the lakes, Lake Superior, it's wider, it's not as deep, and it actually, because of that, there's more volume that can actually support fish life. relative to Lake Tanganyika, even though it's a larger volume. So the water parameters, I know some of you are familiar with cichlids, African cichlids in general. The water parameters, as I said, are not as consistent as you might think, because a lot of times you go on the internet, I'm going to keep African cichlids, I need a high pH and I need a high KH and everything's going to be fine. And while that's true for the most part, there's a considerable amount of variance when you look at the water parameters in that lake. So even pH, it can go anywhere from an 8.3 to a 9.0. And believe it or not, the pH in that lake actually goes down as you get deeper. And one of the reasons for that is as you get really deep into that lake, there really isn't a lot of life down there. There's almost no dissolved oxygen, so you're really not going to have a lot of fish. But what you do have are a lot of anaerobic microbes. And those anaerobic microbes produce hydrogen sulfide. And that actually tends to lower the pH over time. And so for the most part, where the fish are generally living at those depths, you're going to get pH that's somewhere at least 8.5 or higher. When you get lower into the low eights, there's not a lot of fish down there. The other cool thing, temperatures, there's actually a variety. Again, a lot of us, we're used to hearing, okay, if you're going to keep African cichlids, keep in the upper 70s, and that's going to be fine. And it is. But there tends to be a rather large range depending on where you're at in the lake. The lake is a pretty big, it's surrounded by about 4 different countries. So the lake is very long, it's very deep, and so as you get really low into that, really deep into that lake, the temperatures go down considerably, all the way down into the low 70s. And then of course there's some seasonality too, so some of those areas, they're gonna be a little bit cooler from time to time. The water hardness, that is relatively consistent, usually looking at around mid-teens or so in your KH. The other interesting thing, and I kind of hinted at it, is the dissolved oxygen. Again, the reason why you're not finding fish low down in that lake is because there's not a lot of dissolved oxygen down there. There's nothing for them to breathe. They basically suffocate. You've got microbes down there, but that's about it when you get really far down. All right, so the fish. That's why we're here. It's like, well, thanks for the lake information. Can we talk about the fish now? Yes. Now, just a caveat here, I am not approaching this as a scientist who's going to go through the classifications, because for the average hobbyist, that's like, well, okay, that was interesting, but how is that helping me keep these fish in a fish tank when I get home? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to break them up into categories that I think make sense to the hobbyist. All right, these are not scientific categories. You're not going to read in like the encyclopedia. Anybody still have encyclopedias? Like, anybody know what those are? Let's just start there. All right. Do you remember how exciting it was? You'd have like a book report, like, okay, it's time to go to the encyclopedia, and look at, you have like a paragraph, like, all right, how am I going to plagiarize this? I don't really have much to write here. Now, my students can go on the internet and be like, oh, I got a whole thing here I can do. This grouping that we have here, that is my personal grouping, because I think that's the way the fish behave when you keep them in captivity and when you keep them in a tank. So for instance, we're going to talk about the shell dwellers, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight some of the cool ones and talk about their care requirements, and then we're going to get into the rock dwellers, which are really awesome. And so sometimes when we're talking about Lake Tanganyikans, it's like, okay, I've heard of the shell dwellers, but some of these other ones, it's like, oh, well, there's other fish there you can keep besides multis and similis and all that. And then I'm going to get into the open water fish, which are some of the coolest, possibly some of the most expensive fish you'll find in the average freshwater fish keeping hobby. And then I do these last two groups, the small and large predators. Keep in mind, some of the fish I'm going to talk about, I will recognize that they fit into multiple groups, but this is just kind of the way I organize it. So if you want to see a piece of my brain, there it is. You're about to see it. So shell dwellers, this is a video of our 50-gallon lowboy. If you've been watching the channel at all, you will know that this is one of the tanks that we feature quite a bit. The shell dwellers, some of the most common. This is not an all-exclusive list. All right, so these fish here are some of the more popular ones. These are the multis, Neolamprologus multifasciatus, and then you've got the similis, the brevis, the ocellatus, calypterus, meleagris. Again, there's over a dozen shell dwellers easily. I think I've probably bred maybe 8 or 9 of them, but I wanted to hit on some of the ones that you're probably going to find out there. So if you were interested in shell dwellers, you're like, oh, you know what? I can actually find these on the internet, or I can go to the store and you can actually see them. Some of the other ones are a little bit harder to find, maybe a little bit more expensive, but they're all really cool. If you've never kept shell dwellers, especially if you've got smaller tanks, this might be a fish for you. So if you're looking for like that gateway, anybody ever kept shell dwellers? How many of you kept them before? Raise your hand, be proud, you're proud. All right, so only a few of you have. These are great fish. A lot of people shy away from the cichlids because like, I don't want to deal with aggression, and I heard that they fight all the time. These guys here, these are Neolamprologus similis. Really cool fish. They look like the multis. They're a little bit darker. I like to keep them on a dark sand substrate. Their colors tend to show really nice. But what's cool about them is you're getting a small fish. Now these fish are only going to be, like the males, maybe a little over like 1.25 inches, maybe 1.5 inches. Females stay a little bit smaller, and as you might imagine, being a shell dweller, that's where they spend a lot of their life. Great cichlid personality. What's cool about them is for some of you who are like, hey, I don't have space for like these giant tanks for these cichlids. So what you can do with the shell dwellers is, for the most part, if you've got a 20-gallon tank, you're good. That's most of what, for the most part, that's what they require. Now, could you put them in a 10? I've had people breed the Maltese in a 10 and the Similis. It gets a little tricky because then as they start having fry, you got to remove some of the fry just to kind of keep them from running out of space. But what's really awesome about them, if you've never kept them, is they've got this really cool community dynamic where they form a hierarchy and they get their territories. And if you get shell dwellers that are really angry at one another, they generally, for the most part, at least in our experience, they don't necessarily like outright fight a lot, but they'll go over and spit sand and bury each other's shells and just do really, they're like little brothers and sisters. They just do these really annoying things like, oh yeah? Yeah, I saw what you did. You took 3 of my ladies. Well, I'm going to go over there. When you're not paying attention, I'm going to bury your shell. So have fun digging that out. So they will do that kind of stuff. Some of the easier ones, like the Maltese and the Similis, they are easy to breed. And a lot of people, that's really exciting. How many of you have bred fish before? There is something about it. If you've never seen that aspect of fish keeping, it's exciting. I don't care if you've been breeding fish for decades or what kind of fish you've been breeding. How many, like you see guppy babies and like, oh my God, I still do that. I've been keeping fish for like 42 years. I'm like, oh my gosh, there's the guppy babies. Hey, everybody, look, the guppy babies are up there. Well, these are the same way. They're really tiny babies, and it's so rewarding when you see them. They finally get the courage, and they peek their head out of the shell. It's like, hey, Mommy, what's going on out there? And it's so cool. Now, they don't have big groups of fry, but you might see a half a dozen, 6 or 8 or so, and that is really exciting. So if you want a fish that's relatively easy to breed, and oh, by the way, the Maltese and the Similis especially, they don't eat their fry. For the most part. So it's cool because you don't have to worry about what am I going to put guppy grass up there or hornwort and are they, what's going to happen. For the most part, at least those two tend to leave their fry alone. And again, the aggression is not horrible. Will they flare at each other and show off and be like, I'm the man. No, I'm the man. No, it's me. So they will do that, but it's not usually like a death match where they wipe each other out, at least not for these ones, the Maltese and the Similis. Why not shell dwellers? Why would you not want to keep them? Those are our gold ocellatus. This was a grow-out tank. That's why they're on gravel here. So don't be like, man, he's talking about shell dwellers. He's not even keeping them on sand. Yes, we do. But these ones, they were in a tank that they had to be separated. Now, these are gold ocellatus. They're a little bit more assertive, a little bit more aggressive. Sometimes you have to remove the fry because the uncles and aunts, this is a weird way to think about it, their aunts and uncles might eat them. So the parents generally don't, but Uncle Bob over there is like, did you see Stanley? He just had a bunch of fry. Come on, Marge, let's go over there and eat them. And they will do that, so often we remove the fry of the gold ocellatus, but maybe they're a little too small for you. Maybe you like larger fish. Maybe you want to keep a community that has larger fish, then maybe the shell dwellers might not be for you. And we'll talk about some other options later, but for the most part, great personality, awesome size, small tanks, easy to keep. And if you live around here, you got the water parameters for them. The water around here, you've got that hard water with a high pH, just like we talked about earlier. It's certainly worth giving it a try. And if you decide, you know what, I'm really not into these fish, I want to try something else, generally speaking, pet stores and stuff, they like them because they can sell them off. So depending on your market, but certainly around here you'd be able to. This is a picture of Neolamprologus meleagris. This is another shell dweller. I actually think, at least in our experience, this is one of the more aggressive ones that we've kept. This was in a 125. That's a fish that's like, yeah, I'm hanging up on my shell. Nobody come by me. It's kind of like, it has like a personality of a gold ocellatus, but these guys, when I kept them with ocellatus in a 125, they ran that part of the whole community. The golds were like, you know what, I don't know if I'm going to do this. Now the shell dwellers, if there's a downside, you're not going to see a ton of color, all right? So you saw the silvers, and these guys get kind of pearly brown. The gold ocellatus are cool, as you saw. They get more of that yellowish color, and they have the purples as well. So if there is a downside to them, in addition to what I already talked about, it's like there's not a ton of color with these guys. This one here is one of my favorites. I want to point out, this is Neolamprologus calypterus. What I love about this fish, that's the male that's got that blue face and the lips, or the blue lips and the yellow face. What's so cool about them is the males are like 4 times larger than the females, and at least in the animal world, they show one of the greatest ranges of sexual dimorphism out there, which means the males are so much larger than the females. There's no way the males will fit in a shell. There's no way. But the females do. And so when they breed, what the male does is, these dudes are crazy. You can put like 50 shells in the tank. We had them in a 33 long. The dominant male went and took every single shell. There were like 4 other males in there and like probably 6 or 8 females. He went and took them all. He had them all piled up on one side, and he would just stand like, what's up, what's up, what's up, what's up? And the other ones are like, hey, dude, man, can we have just like one? what's up? No, you ain't taking nothing. And then you take all the females too. So all the mother males are like, really, dude? I mean, there was more than enough. We all could have been happy, but they took them all. It's a really cool fish. Not as easy to find. Like I said, a little bit larger, but that is a cool thing to see. And sometimes if you're looking for that community dynamic and just seeing what fish do when they're all messed up in the head, this is a good one to take a look at. So clippers, not as easy to find, but if you want to find a fish that's a little psycho, that's one. And stingy, greedy fish. Now, the rock dwellers. A lot of times when we hear about fish from Lake Tanganyika, we're familiar with the shell dwellers. This is a 20 long, and this has got something called Julidochromis ornatus. It's one of the examples I'm going to use today. These fish often tend to be more cylindrical, a little bit elongated. They don't get very large. A lot of them don't get very large. These fish, like the ornatus, the females tend to get a little bit larger. They might top out around 3.5 inches or so, maybe a little larger. Males stay a little bit smaller, but look at the color. And so now we're starting to see some fish. Like I said, this is the ornatus. Other examples would be Julidochromis transcriptus, Lelupi. They get nice color. I'll show you those in a moment. The last two I put an asterisk next to them because it's like, well, these could really kind of go in a couple different categories. If you've watched my videos before, you'll know I've put the Caudopunctatus. I've kind of talked about, they kind of share a lot of similarities to shell dwellers, but they're technically here because they don't use shells to breed. None of these fish really do. And then the Tropheus, which are kind of a whole different sort of thing going on there. But they're awesome. Why would you want to keep them? Because again, this is a fish, if you want to get into cichlids and you want to see some cool action and some cool personality, you often don't need a large tank. The tank I just showed you was a 20 gallon. This was a 33 long, but all these fish would do fine in a 20 long. You get, a male and a few females, and they will often breed like crazy. They got the tiniest, and they'll fry. They're also little tiny copies of the adults. They're little elongated fry, like, hey man, how is it going? This was Julidochromis transcriptus. It's got a really cool pattern, and so when you compare them to shell dwellers, you get a little bit more color, more patterning, same awesome personality. Some of these fish are relatively easy to breed, so again, if you want to see little fish babies, this might be an option for you. The other thing too is they're not going to rearrange your tank quite the way. If you've kept shell dwellers, you know, if you're like an aquascape person or you're just like a neat freak, you're like, you know what, I just set up this tank and it needs to stay exactly like this. Shell dwellers are not for you because they're going to go and just make mounds, they're going to bury shells, and your tank is going to look, messed up. And you're going to fix it, and they're going to mess it up inside of 12 hours again. These guys, they will most likely leave your scape alone, at least more than the shell dwellers do. You can see I've got plants in some of these tanks. They don't eat the plants. They don't really dig them up all that much. They might dig a little bit near the rocks, like the surface, but that's about it. Easy to breed, cool colors. And the other thing, too, is the aggression. For the most part, it doesn't tend to be over-the-top aggressive. Like some of your Mbuna or some of your peacocks, if you ever had like an all-male peacock tank, you're like, yeah, this is great. The dominant male's chasing everybody up into the corners. I don't know how enjoyable this is. These guys are not quite that bad. This is, again, of the 33 long. We got the Neolampologus lelupi. That's the orange ones. They have a yellow variety as well. Those are really cool fish. Again, elongated. You do have some challenges with these fish, and that is you want to get the rock work right. You want to give them space so that they can kind of squeeze in. You're never really going to see these guys mate. At least I never have. You'll see them, they'll go in the rocks, spend a lot of time there, and then all of a sudden you're like, what is those little slivers? Oh my gosh, there's like 30 babies. Not quite 30, but maybe 10. They can be, you really do have to spend some time thinking about the rock work, where the shell dwellers, like, I'm just going to chuck like 40 shells in there and then let them figure it out. These guys, the tank setup is a little bit more. You can have some fry predation, again, especially from aunts and uncles. Our ornatus breed in a 20 long, but they're actually really considerate. The pair stays over to one side. They've got the sponge filter side. That's the prime real estate. And they're like, we're just going to stay over here. And then they push the other 3 or 4, not really push, but like, you guys just stay over on the other side of the 20 long and everything's going to be fine. And they do. And then when the fish get a little bit older, they get to about an inch, like, we have to have a talk. It's time for you to move out, and you need to go to the other side of the tank because you're too big. And our fish are like, all right, well, I'll go out on my own. And they do. And they leave home, and they hang out over on the other side. But these are really cool fish. These are the Caudopunctatus. Again, with these fish, I breed these in a 20 high. I started with 6. 2 different pairs had fry in that tank, and we wound up with, like, I don't know, at one point we probably had 100 of them in there. I broke them out into a second tank, and then for those of you who watch the videos, you know, these are the fish that I lost most of those fish when the sponge filters went down, and I still have 9, and now they're starting to show like they want to breed again. But these are great fish because, again, even though they kind of straddle rock dwellers, shell dwellers, I consider them the size. They're about the same size as a shell dweller, so they stay small. Again, a 20-gallon tank is perfectly fine. You get a little bit of color with the yellow. That's kind of nice. Personalities, they really do act a lot like shell dwellers. I do put shells in those tanks because what they'll do is they'll have the babies, they'll breed in the rocks, they'll bring the babies out, and then they'll put the babies in the shells sometimes. They'll move them all over and be like, come on over here. This is a nice little place for you to hang out. It's like a little kiddie place, area for them to hang out. So they do use the shells to put their babies into, but they won't breed in them necessarily. If you ever get these fish, what's so cool about them is they can change their patterning in a second. Like 1 second, they're looking like this, and I wish I had it, but when they have fry, they will kind of tilt downwards like this, and then they will get these black stripes, almost look like a zebra, and they just kind of put their head down like, get out of here, plow their way through, and that's a warning to all the other fish. Hey man, I'm serious business. We got fry over here. If you come over here, you're gonna have a problem. So it's a really cool fish, but it happens. Some of the fastest coloration changes I've ever seen were with these fish and just how quickly they do that. Again, they're just kind of interesting, not something you see every day, easy to keep, smaller tank, cool personality. This is a map. In case you didn't know, it's a map. These are the trophyists. I wanted to spend a couple seconds talking about those. Again, I put them in this rock dweller category because I spend a lot of time by the rocks. They'll breed in them. But what I find so interesting, and this is just a map of the trophyists, but you could do the same map for different shell dwellers, for the rock dwellers like the Julidochromis we've already talked about. There are lots of varieties of trophyists, and they're really cool. Some of them have amazing color. And you find them all over Lake Tanganyika, so they have collection points. So a lot of times when you're buying fish from Lake Tanganyika or Lake Malawi or even Lake Victoria, they will have names after the fish, like species, whatever, and that's the point, that's the place in which they collected them, and they'll have different features, different colors, and it's really cool. Now this is, again, some underwater footage of the trophyists. What I like about these fish is, again, that dynamic that they have in a community. I will say these guys tend to be a lot more aggressive than all the fish we've talked about so far, all right? Little bit harder to manage the aggression, not over the top, but these are fish where so far what we've talked about is keeping fish in mostly like a 20 gallon or larger. If I'm setting up a tank for trophyists, me personally, I'd like to have at least a 75, if not a 6-foot tank, and get a big colony. It's easier to manage that aggression, but they get some amazing color. But I would not necessarily consider it's like, don't do the trophy like, yeah, I'd like the Lake Tanganyikans. I'm just going to go ahead and buy a group of trophyists and stick them in I don't know, let's do a 40 breeder. Like, that might be a little bit difficult to manage. The other fish we've mentioned so far might be a better option. So feeding the trophyists, the other fish we've mentioned so far, really easy to feed. We feed all kinds of pellets and flakes, and sometimes we'll do frozen bloodworms, frozen brine shrimp. All of our shell dwellers get live baby brine because we never know where the babies are at, so I'm just squirting live baby brine all over those tanks. These guys, they like a high degree of vegetable matter. It mostly has to do with the normal flora in their gut. I've heard people, they've kind of transferred over to more meaty foods slowly over time, and it's worked for them. But for the most part, these guys like to eat the algae and stuff like that. So the diet-wise, it's a little bit more challenging than some of the fish we've talked about so far, but still pretty cool. The open water fish. If I were to pick a category of fish that we're going to talk about today, these are the Cyprichromis leptosoma that we have in a 40 breeder. These are like your showcase centerpiece fish, in my opinion, for a Lake Tanganyikan tank. They are some of the most beautiful cichlids, maybe some of the most beautiful freshwater fish you're going to see. These include things like the Cyprichromis. There are the other ones called the featherfins, Ophthalmotilapia. That genus has a lot of really, really cool fish. Neolamprologus burchardi, again, I put a little asterisk here because they do spend a lot of time by the rocks, but in an aquarium, they spend a lot of time just swimming around, so I kind of include them in here. But these Cyprichromis leptosoma are amazing fish, and there's different collection points for those too. You've got the jumbos, you've got the standards. They're amazing. They will add, if you're looking for a Lake Tanganyikan setup, like maybe like a larger tank, don't let anybody tell you, oh, those fish are mostly just ground and bray and silver and they're boring. No, when you get into the open water like featherfins, and you've already seen some of the rock dwellers have some color, these guys have some really striking colors as well. This again, underwater footage of some of the featherfins here. Again, why would we keep them? It's all about the color. It's about the finish. I mean, you look at some of these fish, and they've got these long tail fin trailers and dorsal fin and anal fins. It's just amazing, amazing stuff. The burchardis, which I will show you in a second, those actually tend to be pretty easy to breed. So much so that your tank can get overrun with these things, and they can get a little bit aggressive when they do start to breed. Like, that's great. I've got a tank full of burchardis that won't let anything else live. But you look at these things. This was from Jason's fish room when I did his fish room tour. Absolutely love these fish, the Nasuda, but you see the really rich, vibrant color. And these actually, they were fairly young. If you give them some time, those fins that you see, they will get much longer trailers, and they look absolutely stunning. Absolutely amazing. Now, these are not cheap fish by any stretch of the imagination. These guys here, the furcifers, I had a group of these. You guys want to take a pause and hear a sad story? I don't know if I'll be able to handle it. I had a group, I saw these fish in his fish room, went to a rare fish auction, found them, got 8 of them, put them in a 33 long. I'm like, oh yeah, I'm gonna have these awesome fish too. You know what I learned? These guys love to jump, and they are experts at it. If you leave like a little feeding hole this big, you'll find these bad boys on the floor. I don't know how they do it. Like, all right, hold on. I think I see the escape. If we escape, we're gonna go into the big body of water where the couch is over there. So, and they just do it. Or if you're cleaning the tank, a lot of these guys and some of the rock dwellers, it was very common with the Lelupai, the orange cylindrical ones. You open up the lid and you're doing like tank maintenance, and all of a sudden like, why are you on the floor? Come on, man. So you have to be careful with some of these, especially these guys. They love to jump. So the sad story is I started with 8. And by the way, I paid, even at the rare fish auction, not retail, I paid a lot of money for these fish. You know what I got left? 2 females. Last I checked, downside of these fish, the females, the feather fins, are silver. They don't look like all blue and yellow. So it's like, okay, that's a downside. 2, I have yet to figure out a way to get 2 females to produce offspring in a fish tank. So if you guys ever figure that out, let me know, because I would really love to start up a new group, but I don't think that's going to happen unless I spend a bunch more money trying to track down a male. So anyway, but these are really, really, really amazing fish. These guys get a little bit larger. The furcifers, they're going to get larger, need a little bit of a larger tank. And that's something these are Burchardi, so that's some underwater footage of the Burchardi I was talking about. These are more common, so if you're looking for like an open water fish, that might be a little bit more common. If you're trying to do like a lake Tanganyika setup, which we'll talk more about later, this might be a really good option for you. But they can breed a lot, and they can definitely cause you some issues. Like, what am I going to do with all these fry? The feather fins and the sips, these are some of the most expensive cichlids out there. If you were to go and look at the Cyprichromis or the furcifer that I just showed you and walk into a pet store, if they have them, at about a size of a couple inches, you could pay 60, 70, 80 bucks a fish. Now, if you're saltwater, like, dude, what are you crying about, man? I spent 500 bucks on a fish yesterday. I know, but I'm freshwater, and so when I see price tags for 2-inch fish that are approaching 100 bucks, I'm like, and then they all jump out of the tank. It's like, yeah, you tend to not to want to do that again. But yeah, they can be expensive, and if you get them full grown, they can go $100 plus for a group. And you really do want to keep these open water swimmers in a group. So if you buy them retail, you could be into this thing for $400 or $500. So the feather fins might not be the fish for the beginner, but if you want to do a larger tank setup, and I would say that's something else to consider when you're doing Cyprichromis, when you're doing the ophthalmotilapia. At that point, it would be nice to have a 4-foot tank, like at least a 55, a 75 would be even better. And you could start setting up a tank. Now you start thinking about it, like, oh, I can put some of these fish together. I have a little section, maybe half a 75 for the shell dwellers, open area with some shells, and I got a 75 or a 55, and I've got some rock work over here for my rock dwellers, and then maybe I've got my Cyprichromis, then they're kind of hanging out on top. That can be a pretty cool thing to see. You might not see a lot of fry because they might start picking off each other's fry. I keep the Cyprichromis with a shell dweller. I don't see a lot of shell dweller babies, but I do see a lot of the Cyprichromis fry. But these are really cool fish. Now the small predators, I know I'm showing this again, these are the furcifer, but in this tank, in that same tank, there was something called a compressiceps. And so I'm grouping the small predators in really a couple of kinds that you'll find in the hobby pretty readily, compressiceps and calvus. They look the same. The calvus tend to be little miniature versions of the compressiceps, and what's cool about them, and you're going to see them showing up here in a second, is they're rather menacing looking. So if you're somebody who's like, I want a menacing, dangerous looking fish, like this guy here, but I don't want to have it, completely overrun a tank, these are really cool. They've got kind of like this downward slope. They're really skinny, and they just look like they're going to destroy everything. Like, yeah, I'm walking around. This is me. I'm going to walk around. It's my tank. They're cool looking. Other nice thing is, this is our 125. The calvus, they actually stay pretty small. And so I know people who breed those in a 20. What's interesting about them is their scaling is extremely sharp. So if you have fish that try to nip at them or pick at them, they can do damage to their mouth. So they don't tend to pick on these fish. And these guys actually aren't all that aggressive. They look menacing, and they are predators, make no mistake, small predators. So if you put them in a tank and you want to keep your shell dweller fry, or like, I've got Cyprichromis, bye-bye, bye-bye. They eat them all. So that's just what they do. But it's cool because you get a whole different body shape, right? And so sometimes it's not just about the color that you put in your tank. A lot of people focus on that, like, I want some blue fish, I want some red ones, I want some orange ones, and I want some silver ones. The other thing to think about, no matter what we're talking about, whether it's the shell dwellers or the Lake Tanganyikan fish or just community fish, sometimes the other thing that can add a lot of interest is different body shapes. So sometimes you might put angelfish that have that round body shape, and you might put some coolie loaches that look like little snakes all flying around. But that's another way to add interest to a tank. Now, you do have to consider the downsides of these guys while they stay small. Breeding-wise, they're a little bit difficult because The joke, anybody know what the joke with these guys are? What their downside is? They take forever to grow, forever. You'll get these little compressiceps. You'll get them about this size, a couple inches. And the joke in the hobby is like, how big are your compressiceps? Yeah, they're about 2.5 inches. Oh, so you've had them for about 10 years now? They grow really slow. Takes a while for them to breed, but that's also the reason why when you see them at a store, they're pretty expensive, because whoever grew those fish out, if you're getting them at a decent size, they've had them for a while. They've been feeding them. They've been taking up storage space for them, maintaining an environment for them. So these guys can get expensive too. It's not uncommon to see these compressiceps, especially some of the rarer ones with the nicer colors. In the Calvus, you might easily see $60, $70 a piece for those fish, but they are cool. They do add a lot of personality, and they're not overly aggressive, like I said. Now, the large ones, I really just included the large ones because in the aquarium hobby for Lake Tanganyika fish, it really is about the frontosa. These are amazing fish. They get big. I did a species profile on them not long ago. And one of the points that I tried to make, and this is in nature, but often they do best in a large colony, but these fish can grow large. So this is one here. This was at Ohio Fish Rescue, and I filmed this tank because it's very rare that you see a frontosa tank done correctly and where the fish are just like chilling out. They all look great. Look at the finnage. Look at the way they're acting. They're not active fish. The big mistake, if you ever run across frontosa, you'll be like, oh, this fish is going to grow to 12 inches. It's going to totally handle those mbuna and the peacocks. No, it won't. A lot of times, these guys aren't overly aggressive. They tend to be very chilled out. When you put them in a tank filled with Lake Malawi fish, they often get outcompeted for food. They often get bullied, especially when they're smaller. And they also take a long time to grow, just like the compressiceps. So not often the best. I'm sure some of you have done it, like, oh, I didn't have any problems. But it's really not an ideal situation for these guys. They're huge. They'll get 12 to 13 inches easily. That's how big these fish were. That tank that you were looking at, let me go back. Let me see if it'll play. See if it'll play again. All right, good. So that tank you were looking at was 7 feet long. It was, if I remember correctly, Rich told me it was 7 feet long, 40 inches tall, and 40 inches wide. I wish I would have been standing in front of the tank so you could see just how large that tank was. When you're putting 20 full-grown frontosa in a tank, that was a massive tank. But that's why they're so relaxed. The coolest thing about these fish are obviously the color. There's all different types, and the colors are all amazing on all the different varieties. But it's the fins. They get these really long dorsal trailers. The anal fins look great, pectoral fins. To see that, they have to be in the proper environment, because if they're not, they're going to start beating each other up. Breeding-wise, it can take a while because they have to get to size. Ideally, you want a male, throw 5 or 6 females in there with them, and that's a pretty cool thing. It's, like I said, it's not an aggressive fish. It's not an overly active fish, but you need a very large tank to deal with them in the colony. The other downside to these guys is a lot of the other fish we've talked about so far, you're not putting in with these guys, because look at the size of their mouth. In nature, they're going to eat the cyprichromis, they eat the feather fins, they wait for them to kind of settle down at night, and then just eat them up. So I've had people be like, you know what, I had some frontosa, and they went out, and we just talked about how expensive some of those fish are, right? So they went out, and they're like, yep, I bought some cyprichromis, and that was a $200 mistake, because they're all gone. Yeah, because Big Mouth over there decided he's going to eat them. They're not aggressive, but fish will generally eat other fish that can fit inside their mouth. So can be expensive too, especially if you get full-grown ones. I've seen full-grown or close to full-grown 10-inch frontosas easily go for $150 to $200 a piece. So it's best to get them small. And the nice thing is, if you do buy them small, if it's something you want to do, you can put them in a smaller tank. You can put them in a 40 breeder or a 55. They're going to take a little while to grow out and be like, okay, now I'm going to get that 6-foot tank, or in this case, maybe an 8-foot tank. If I was going to do it, I'd probably go out and find an 8-foot tank that maybe not quite 700 gallons like the one we saw. It would definitely be an interesting idea. These are just some of the cool fish. So if I was going to do a community, again, I've kind of mentioned this, but something to think about, if you wanted to do a tank, like a Lake Tanganyika setup, you could easily do something where you've got your shell dwellers, you've got your rock dwellers. If you're going to do that, ideally, it's best to try to do it in like a 4-foot tank. Give your shell dwellers a little side with no rocks, or very few rocks, but mostly shells. Put in about twice as many shells as you have shell dwellers. Give them some space. Put some rock work on the other side. You can use your rock-dwelling fish, your Julidachromis, your Leilupi. You're going to get some color from them, and then you've got your little small predators. Maybe you put some Calvus in there. They're going to hang out by the rocks. You've got your open water guys. I really, really love the Cyprichromis. These are actually the jumbos. They get a little bit larger, but the Cyprichromis are great because they're going to stay at the top, and when they have fry, they spit out fry, but they only spit out like 3 or 4, and they're miniatures of the adults, and they're big. So a lot of the smaller shell dwellers and stuff, they don't eat them because they're too big to eat. And then you've got yourself a setup And you can always transfer those into larger tanks as they grow up, but the nice thing is they don't get really all that big. Cool fish, lots of color, lots of variety. It's awesome. So, questions? Oh, good question. So the question was, in nature, Lake Tanganyika there's not really a lot of plant life there, so what is done about the nitrates? What's in nature, and it's hard for us to replicate it. Obviously, we try sometimes. You've got different types of specialized media that create anaerobic environments, but in nature, that stuff is all there, right? So you've got the microbes on Lake Tanganyika living in anaerobic environments that can go through the denitrification process where they're taking the nitrate, breaking it back down, eventually into nitrogen gas, which dissipates, right? So that's primarily how that system is going to operate to complete the full nitrogen cycle. In nature, that's happening. Right, I don't care if we're talking about Lake Tanganyika or a river or a pond. You've got microbes there that are taking those nitrates and converting them as well, not just the plants. That's a great question. Yeah. So the question was 29 gallon, thinking about putting shell dwellers on the bottom and looking for something else in a 29, right? Whether it's Compressiceps, Calvis, something like that, right? What I would, if it were me setting up a 29 gallon and I'm going to be doing something with shell dwellers, that for me would be the only fish I would put in there if I want the fish to breed. And that's one of the coolest things about them is, you get a half a dozen. You want to see that half dozen turn into 20 or 30, which is awesome. The problem with a 29 is, believe it or not, a lot of people think the shell dwellers exclusively stay at the bottom of the tank. That's not the case. What winds up happening is as their numbers grow, they will inhabit further and further up the water column. Like we have a group of multis and a 40 breeder, and yeah, for the most part, they like to stay near the bottom, but you'll see a fair number of them also inhabiting the midwaters, and when they start to breed, they become slightly more aggressive. So could you put Calvis or I probably wouldn't put the Compressiceps because they get a little bit larger. Could you do that? Maybe, but then you've got to deal with the fact that you still have multis that are going to be defensive, and if those Calvis start coming into their territory with fry, you might get some fighting. So generally speaking, if I'm going to do something with my shell dwellers and I'm going to add a second type of fish, I really do want at least a 40 breeder to give them a little bit more space so I can build that rock work up a little bit easier. I know the 40 breeder is not much taller than, or maybe it's not even taller than a 29, they're about the same, but it's that extra volume. And the setup that I have with the Cyprichromis and brevis is not ideal, because I am not getting any shell dweller breeding out of that tank whatsoever. I might get like one or two fry that survive periodically, but it's very uncommon. The Cyprichromis, they survive because the fry stay near the top and they're large, and the brevis generally don't eat them.
I made the mistake of putting 10 cherry shrimp in a 125 that I've got mainly nano fish in. What a disaster. I mean, there's just like zillions of them in there. So I don't want that to happen with the multis, where their fry are just all over the place.
You will get, in a large tank, you'll get a lot of fry. And one of the things that's a challenge for them is when they want to remove the fry, if they've got too many, they like to just go right back in the shells. So if you ever run into that situation, if you're ever breeding shell dwellers, I'll give you a little pro tip here. If you're ever breeding shell dwellers and you need to get them out of the shells because you need to send them to a pet store, someone wants some, get a 5-gallon bucket, put a bunch of rocks down in the bucket, put tank water in there, make sure it's about the same temperature, a sponge filter, cycled sponge filter, and then put a piece of egg crate over the rocks, take the shells out, put them on top of the egg crate, wait till overnight. The shell dwellers are going to come out of the shells and be like, why are we so close to the surface? They're going to go down into the rocks, remove the shells, the egg crate, the rocks, and all your multis will be down there in the bottom. So that's an easier way to do it. It takes a little bit of time, but yeah. I see questions back there.
This is kind of a follow-up to the original question. So dealing with our nitrates, other than water changes, could we, are we able to use like floating plants, or will they eat those? Maybe a Nubius or something a little bit more hardy, is that acceptable?
Yeah, great question, absolutely. And I kind of show that a little bit, like the Cyprichromis tank and stuff. We have plants in most of our tanks, and I know it's not a biotope tank, like, dude, you just put plants in it. I don't really care, I like it. So, but yes, absolutely. They generally, the shell dwellers, the rock, I've never really had Lake Tanganyikan fish eat plants. With the shell dwellers, you have to worry about all the digging they do, so then your floating plants, like you suggested, like the hornwort, taking a Nubius and gluing that to rocks or something like that, that works perfectly fine, although the Nubius isn't going to do a whole lot with the nitrates because it grows so slow. But definitely hornwort, water wisteria, water sprite, they leave it all alone. You saw we got a bunch of val in our 33 long with all those fish. The rock dwellers, they, for the most part, don't dig a lot. So with the rock dwellers and stuff, yeah, for sure.
As a beginner with shell dwellers, as a beginner, and I wanted to do maybe 2 sets of different types of shell dwellers, which ones would you recommend to put together?
That's a really good question. So can you mix the shell dwellers? It depends on the size of the tank. I personally don't mix them unless I've got at least a 4-foot tank so they can have their own space, because they will tend to kind of want to form their own little crew. I would try, and you still got to be careful because there's a chance you could get some hybridization, especially between the Simless and the Maltese, which are the two easiest. So in no circumstances do I mix those two fish because they look so similar. They will absolutely hybridize, and then you wind up with a mess on your hands. The idea there is you've got to find fish that are relatively equally matched in their personalities. So that the ones that tend to be not quite as aggressive, like the Maltese, the Simless, which I said I wouldn't mix those. The Brevis, maybe you could do a Brevis multi-mix, but again, if you get some hybridization, now all bets are off. I would not want to put those fish out into circulation. Could you do like the Ocellatus and Meleagris like we did? That tended to work pretty well because they're both a little bit more assertive. And now that was a 6-foot tank too. Again, I'm talking about having a 4-foot tank to mix those. Anything less than that, I probably wouldn't. I would probably opt to have the shell dwellers in a tank and do their thing in a community because it's really interesting to see.
Kind of along the lines of some of the other questions you were talking about, possibly having a tank where you got the shell dwellers, you got the rock dwellers, and you got open water, I think you said. So say you have a 55, is there a dream combination you see, and is there any combination you definitely would not avoid?
In a 55-gallon best combination, you pick the shell dweller, whatever one you think is great, because you've got a lot of space there, whether that's the Ocellatus, the Brevis. There's so many more. By the way, we didn't even scratch the surface here. I hope you understand that I left out entire groups that I knew I wasn't going to be able to get to. I mean, and some of the more interesting ones, some of you have kept Lake Tanganyika. He's like, dude, he didn't even cover the goby-like ones, or I left out whole groups just because of time. I couldn't fit them all in. If I were doing something that's going to be more beginner-like, I would just pick my favorite shell dweller. I might start more simple with the Maltese, the Brevis, the Simless, and then I really like the combination with the Cyprichromis. There's multiple types of Cyprichromis because they're really not that aggressive. They don't tend to chase other fish around all that much. The males will kind of just get next to one another and kind of flare and shimmy and do that kind of thing. But those are the two that I really like. A lot of people like to try to do shell dwellers with Brochardi because they're also very common. Again, the issue, you got to be careful with the Brochardi because their fry, they'll breed in the rocks, then they'll bring their fry out. But not only do the parents protect the fry, the rest of the group will too. And they're fairly assertive, so they might start beating on other fish, and now you start getting into this competition thing where they're trying to pick each other off. That's why I like the Cyprichromis with the Maltese or the Simless because they tend to leave each other alone, especially in a 55 because that's a taller tank. You'll probably get a lot more fry survival even with the Shellies in that. Could you do a third? Sure, yeah. You could do the rock dwellers. You could pick your favorite one, Transcriptus, that we talked about, Leilupai, absolutely. Yeah, but then you'd want to just make sure that the rock area that you have is separate from the shell area that you have, just so that you don't have a lot of competition for that prime real estate.
As you know, I have my blood parrots that I rescued, and some of them have gill curl on a permanent basis because of the abuse that they took before them. For African cichlids that would have any kind of gill curl, is there anything you could think to protect them, especially the shell dwellers that are down in the sand all the time?
I actually haven't found that to be an issue with any of the fish. And part of that is the genetics of the fish that you're bringing in and if you're going to be breeding them. But what's really interesting about those fish, the shell dwellers and especially the feather fins, is the genetic abnormalities that you often see. Some of you, if you've ever bred guppies, you get these guppies and like, oh, that's great. The guppies, half of them got bent spines. You know, the fry are like, I got to do some culling here. But at least with like our Maltese, we've been breeding them now for a very long time. And it's the same colony. And they're still kicking out fry that look fantastic. Same thing with the feather fins too. So it just seems to be that we haven't diluted the genetic pool like we have with some other fish, like some of the live bearers and stuff. So not nearly as big of an issue.
When it comes to general hardness of water, what is the minimum general hardness for frontosis?
The minimum Juliochromis?
Frontosis.
Oh, minimum frontosa.
Yeah.
If you're keeping them at least in the upper single digits, 8 to 9, with your KH, you're going to be fine. If you can get that higher into the 10, 11, 12, even better.
So 12 is the best, right?
Well, somewhere in there. I mean, Lake Tanganyika is even a little bit higher than that. So, but in terms of, I haven't seen a big difference, and maybe some of you have, but I haven't. When I've had friends keep them and breed them at a KH of 7, 8, 9, they seem to be doing fine, great color. Those fish will live. By the way, the frontosa will live for decades. So you've got a commitment on your hands where you're looking at fish that could be 12, 15 years old or older, and they've lived that long. One of the people I talked to in the club, that's what he does. He did that for a long time as a living, is breed frontosas, and he was breeding them at a KH of 8, keeping them right around 7. Most of these fish are fine, right around 78 degrees, right. And they did great for a very long time. You're welcome. Up here.
I'm going to make this a little quick so anybody else has questions. Can you do a Wallstead method tank with shell dwellers? Is it possible? They'll dig down to the dirt.
Great question. With the shell dwellers, I would not. because they will dig more than you realize, and they're not very big fish, but they will take what they love, especially some of like the ocelots and stuff, they want to bury their entire shell and just the top sticks out. They will almost always go all the way to the glass. And it's not just about burying their shells, they like massive mounds, because those massive mounds also provide them some security because it's a line of sight block. It's kind of giving them that territory. So it's not just about, oh, I've got these shells here. They're going to go all the way down and they're going to build up these massive mounds of sand. So yeah, that's a great question. I definitely wouldn't put any kind of dirt in there. Any other questions? Got one back, a couple more.
I know with Malawi cichlids, you can keep catfish, and there's usually no problem. Are there any catfish that you can keep with Tanganyikans?
That's a great question because it's not something I really covered. Yeah, so in terms of tank mates for pretty much all the fish, now frontosa are a little bit different because they get so large, but some of the larger plecos you could certainly do. You might consider some like the Raphael cats. I know we're getting completely off the Lake Tanganyikans, right? But the Synodontis would do well. Some of the larger Synodontis, I wouldn't go like, the little dwarf types, but Synodontis cats. We do pretty much all of our Lake Tanganyika, all of our tanks have bristlenose. As soon as we go to a 20 gallon or larger, we got bristlenose in all of those tanks. So yeah, you definitely have some options between the bristlenose, your larger plecos. You gotta be careful with those because some of them, the water parameters are very, very different, but bristlenose don't care. The Synodontis, that's an African catfish. And then your Raphael cats, sure, yeah.
Is black diamond blasting sand too sharp for the shell dwellers?
Another really great question. How many of you have ever used that black blasting yeah, so a lot of you have. It can be a little bit sharp. Saying that though, a lot of guys in our club, I belong to the Greater Chicago Cichlid Association, and most of the people, when they want black sand, that's what they've been using. They've been using it for a long time, many years. So, and a lot of them keep shell dwellers, and they haven't reported any issues. But it's a really good question, and what I don't do it, it's something certainly to consider. Do you want to take that chance? Because it can be sharp, right? When you've got those shellies, when you've got those shellies and they're constantly spitting the sand. I mean, it's the same thing like with a Geophagus. When they're constantly down there, I don't do it. I know people have that said it didn't matter, but I'm personally not willing to take the chance. All right, everybody. Well, thank you so much. Like I said, if you have more questions, I'll be back in the YouTube booth. Really appreciate you being here. Thank you.